The air inside the bunker beneath the Rutschstrasse was a thick, recycled soup of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of spent shell casings. For days, the world had been reduced to the flickering yellow of candlelight and the rhythmic, bone-shaking thud of American 155mm long toms hammering the concrete overhead. When the order finally came to step out, the transition was a physical assault. American officers Paget and Haswell emerged from the subterranean gloom into a world that felt too bright, too sharp, and far too loud. They clutched a makeshift white flag, a piece of cloth that felt impossibly flimsy, against the whizzing of sniper rounds that continued to snap through the air, indifferent to the protocols of surrender. As they stepped over the jagged remains of a city that had once been the seat of Charlemagne, the smell of cordite and burst sewers clung to their uniforms. Every footfall on the pulverized brick sounded like a gunshot. They walked with their hearts hammering against their ribs, moving toward a ruined house where the German command waited, their eyes scanning the dark hollows of window frames for the glint of a barrel. This was not a clean end to a battle. It was a desperate, shivering gamble in the middle of a total war pilot scheme that had turned an imperial jewel into a graveyard of jagged stone and dragon's teeth. But to understand how these two men came to be walking through the ruins of the first German city to fall, we must look back to the damp, oppressive atmosphere of the Wolf's Lair on September 16, 1944. Inside the concrete headquarters in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler appeared to his generals as a ghost of a man. He was a trembling, broken figure whose hands shook violently over the maps of a crumbling Reich. The Allied khaki-clad tide was washing against the frontier, fueled by a broad front strategy and the heady confidence of the American commanders. The German front was a sieve, but in that room, the atmosphere shifted as the maps showed the United States First Army overextended and running low on petrol. The moment a winter counteroffensive was proposed, the trembling stopped. Hitler's eyes cleared, his posture stiffened, and he transformed back into the focused, fanatical leader who saw opportunity in the mud. He didn't just need a defense, he needed a speed bump. Aachen, the holy soil of the Reich, was designated as the strategic pivot point. It was to be held at all costs, to buy the 6 weeks of grey grace required to organize the massive winter strike that would become the Battle of the Bulge. While Hitler plotted a resurrection of the Wehrmacht, General Courtney Hodges of the First Army moved with the swagger of a victor who believed the war was already won. In his headquarters, he kept a captured bust of Hitler, like a trophy of an inevitable breakthrough. He envisioned a rapid reconnaissance in force, a quick bounce through the flat Stolberg corridor that would shatter the Siegfried Line and open the gates to the Rhine. His officers spoke of the operation as if it were a parade, ignoring the shell burst of logistical reality that left their riflemen short on ammunition and their tanks running on fumes. They saw the West Wall as a relic, not realizing it was a formidable barrier of interconnected pillboxes with 2-yard-thick walls waiting to swallow their momentum. As the first American patrols crossed the brown-on-brown waters of the River Aar, they were met with an eerie silence. They saw Nazi officials scurrying away in gold-braided uniforms and felt the heady rush of liberation. They had no idea they were stepping into a trap designed to trade the lives of every civilian in the city for 42 days of preparation. By mid-September 1944, the khaki-clad tide that had surged across France did not simply slow down, it was violently throttled. The logistical arteries of the First Army suddenly went cold as the strategic focus shifted north toward the ambitious airborne gamble in Holland, known as Operation Market Garden. For the American infantry sitting in the shadow of the Siegfried Line, the result was a sudden, deafening silence from their own supply lines. Petrol was now rationed by the cupful, and artillery shells were hoarded like gold. This was the beginning of the Grey Grace, a week-long lull where the American advance didn't just stop, it curdled in the rain. The frustration of this stalled momentum was crystallized in the mud of the Stolberg corridor during the Scorpion incident, a British-made Scorpion flail tank, a massive multi-ton beast designed to thrash the earth with spinning chains, churned through the thick black muck toward a line of dragon's teeth. The air was thick with the smell of unrefined diesel and the rhythmic metallic thwack 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 of the flails hitting the wet earth. As the tank neared the concrete pyramids, a single heavy chain link caught on the jagged edge of a dragon's tooth. There was a sickening grinding shriek of metal on stone. A jolt that threw the crew against the interior bulkheads, and then a sudden, terrifying stillness. The multi-million-dollar machine was instantly transformed into a static target by a single block of concrete. As the crew scrambled out into the mud, under the whizzing of sniper fire, the incident mirrored a broader reality. The American mechanized blitz was being strangled by the very terrain it sought to conquer. This period of grey grace was not a gift of peace, but a strategic catastrophe. While American soldiers sat in waterlogged foxholes with their toes turning the dull purple of trench foot, the German High Command was feverishly exploiting the silence. Into the vacuum, they funneled the 12th Infantry Division, the legendary Wild Buffaloes. These were not the elderly and infirm. They were a fresh, cohesive force under commanders who understood that every hour of American inactivity was an hour to turn Aachen into a fortress. The sound of the city changed as the disciplined, rhythmic tramp of hobnailed boots and the heavy clatter of assault guns replaced the frantic scurrying of retreating officials. The Americans could only watch through binoculars as the enemy dug in, transforming what should have been a rapid capture into the foundations of a protracted, bloody siege. The narrative now shifts to the Worm River, where the failure of air power became a grim reality. A massive Allied airstrike failed to neutralize the hardened German pillboxes, forcing a pivot from technological warfare to the brutal hand grenade duels of the infantry. In the grueling house-to-house and pillbox-to-pillbox clearing operations, divisions like the Big Red One and Old Hickory were forced into a war of attrition. They relied on individual acts of bravery by non-commissioned officers like Sergeant Hollycross to bridge the gap that air power could not close. Tension rose between the brass in distant chateaus and the field commanders in the mud. While the leadership celebrated a breakthrough, the infantry remained trapped in a violent stalemate against fanatical German reinforcements, including the 1st SS Panzer Division. On October 10th, General Höbner issued a demand for total surrender. When the ultimatum was ignored, Aachen was transformed from a tactical objective into a target for total annihilation. The battle moved into the sewers and cellars. German soldiers and civilians huddled together, surviving on gingerbread while American troops used nibbling tactics to clear individual strongpoints. We see the command of desperation in Colonel Wilk, appointed to defend the city under the threat that his family would be executed if he retreated. The German defense was no longer strategic. It was a symbolic mandate to fight to the last bullet. On October 16th, the American divisions finally linked up, sealing the city. The German counterattacks failed, and the internal command structure began to shatter. When Major Rink abandoned his post, it signaled the end of organized resistance. Now we return to the moment Paget and Haswell stepped into the street with the white flag. The whizzing of sniper rounds still snaps through the air as they make their way toward the bunker. On October 21st, 1944, the end finally comes with Colonel Wilkes' surrender. In a final act of theater, Wilkes stands on the hood of a jeep to address his defeated, hollow-eyed men before being led away. General Courtney Hodges and his staff enter the Charlemagne Chapel. In a moment of profound contrast to the Nazi ideology that claimed the city, the American generals break their military stoicism to kneel in the ruins of the cathedral. The battle is over, but the cost is staggering. 80,000 American casualties and a 6-week delay. While the Allies celebrate the fall of the first German city, we cut back to the Wolf's Lair on the very day of the surrender. Hitler meets with Otto Skorzeny to finalize Watch on the Rhine. Aachen was a speed bump that worked. The delay provided the Wehrmacht the window needed to launch the Battle of the Bulge, extending the war by months. Today, a gay, careless throng of tourists walks through Aachen. They walk over the hidden, violent history of the bunkers and the dead Roman ruin that once was a city that no longer exists. We begin in the deafening, claustrophobic silence of a bunker beneath the shattered streets of Aachen. 2 American officers, Paget and Haswell, step out into the blinding daylight, clutching a makeshift white flag. The air is thick with the smell of cordite and the sharp snap of whizzing bullets that do not stop just because a flag is raised. They are walking into a surreal negotiation in a ruined house, where the fate of the first German city to fall hangs on a razor's edge. But to understand this walk into the mouth of hell, we must look back to September 16th, 1944. In a move that will change the course of the war, he decides to pivot from a desperate defense to a massive winter counter-offensive in the Ardennes. To buy the time he needs, Aachen, the ancient seat of Charlemagne, is designated as a speed bump that must hold at all costs. While General Courtney Hodges boasts of his overconfidence and prepares for a rapid victory, the momentum of the Allied advance is about to be throttled. Resources and fuel are diverted to the airborne gamble in Holland, leaving the American armor stranded in the mud of the German border. A single tank's chain catches on a concrete dragon's tooth, halting an entire armored breakthrough and signaling the end of the Blitz. This week-long lull allows the German High Command to funnel the wild buffaloes of the 12th Infantry Division into the city. What could have been a rapid capture is now a protracted siege. On the morning of October 2, 1944, the sky over the Worm River Valley was supposed to scream with the salvation of Allied air power. General Leland Hobbs and the men of the Old Hickory Division waited for the bombers to vaporize the concrete teeth of the West Wall. They expected a carpet of fire that would leave the German defenders dazed and broken. Instead, they watched in stunned silence as the formation of planes mistook a Belgian canal for the river, banking away to unleash their payloads on a friendly village. The heavy thuds echoing from the rear were not the sounds of a breakthrough, but of a catastrophic error. On the German side of the line, the defenders looked up at the clearing smoke with a dry, mocking skepticism. One officer famously asked, "What bombing?" The failure of this miracle from the sky meant the high-tech war of the future had ended before it began. The coming hours would belong to the primitive, visceral struggle of the infantrymen. This transition from strategic bombardment to tactical slaughter began at the water's edge. The River Worm was not a majestic barrier, but a narrow, sluggish vein of black mud and freezing water that smelled of stagnant rot and industrial runoff. As the American riflemen reached the banks, the promised bridges were nowhere to be found, stalled in the logistical nightmare of the rear. Lieutenant Dom Borton did not wait for the engineers. He grabbed a scavenged wooden fence post, heaved it into the muck, and screamed that they had found their bridge. The men plunged in, the water hitting their waists with a bone-chilling shock that instantly turned their wool trousers into leaden weights. They scrambled up the slick clay banks under a grueling green nightmare of interlocking machine gun fire. The air was sliced by the high-pitched rhythmic sound of German machine guns, a noise like a giant piece of silk being torn in half. Every soldier who made it across was instantly caked in a stink of mud that felt like a second suffocating skin. It was a filth that no amount of hot water in a distant rear area shower could ever truly wash away. Once across the river, the Americans found themselves in a labyrinth of hand grenade duels and industrial-scale execution. The Siegfried Line pillboxes were not merely bunkers. They were subterranean monsters with walls 6 feet thick that breathed fire through narrow slits. Standard artillery bounced off the reinforced concrete like hailstones. The task of silencing them fell to men like Private Uanes, who moved through the acrid yellow smoke of bunker detonations with the grim mechanical focus of a man already dead. Haduit came up dated to the end of the pry. In the shadow of a pillbox near Pallenberg, Uanes crawled through the mud as the weight of his flamethrower tank pulled at his shoulders. He could hear the muffled shouting of German voices inside the concrete, a domestic sound in a place of death. When he reached the opening, he unleashed a jet of liquid fire. The obscene belch of the flamethrower filled the air with the smell of black oil and the terrifying roar of oxygen being sucked from the earth. For a heartbeat, the bunker became a funeral pyre. The scarlet flame illuminated the hollow-eyed, punch-drunk exhaustion of the men watching from the craters. It was a look that made 20-year-old boys look like ancient, broken men. While the infantry bled for every yard of the Worm Valley, suffering 1,800 casualties in just 3 days, the brass in the rear echelon chateaus maintained an atmosphere of clinical detachment. In the barren dining rooms of Belgian estates, Allied generals sipped tea and moved coloured pins across maps, celebrating a breakthrough as if the West Wall had already crumbled. This professional rivalry was a chasm of perception. To the generals, the enemy reinforcements were a tactical problem to be solved with lateral contact. But to the riflemen of the Big Red One huddled in the Badenburg cemetery, the SS were chained dogs who fought with a suicidal ferocity that defied the logic of the map room. The infantrymen pushed forward like farmers behind a plough, their world reduced to the sight of the man in front of them and the black cotton wool puffs of flak in the grey sky. They endured the digestive distress of chocolate rations and the indignity of lice-ridden straw. Their toes turned a dull purple in the damp, while their commanders issued orders for a nibbling process that required squads to wait for contact before moving. It was a rigid, bureaucratic pace that only served to extend the time they spent under the hammering of German guns. The breakthrough was not a surge, but a slow, agonizing puncture. At Rimberg Castle, the Baroque opulence of 18th century stone was shattered by the whizzing of 20mm fire that cut through the air like tropical rain. Private Elmer Mackay and Alfred Berlan lay flat against the earth as the frontline soldiers fought for their lives in the ghost town silence of Alsdorf. The human cost of bridging the gap that air power had failed to close was written in the mud. The American divisions were being ground down into a state of total war fatigue, where they simply ceased to care about the outcome. They were moved only by the primitive instinct to silence the next pillbox. As the long black fingers of October nights reached into the valley, the Americans had finally breached the line. But the victory was a Pyrrhic one, leaving behind a trail of shattered bunkers and men who had seen the world vanish in a thick cloud of smoke and red jets of flame. By the morning of October 10, 1944, the tactical patience of the American High Command had evaporated, replaced by a cold industrial resolve. General Clarence Huebner, of the Big Red One, issued a final ultimatum to the German commander: total surrender or total annihilation. When the deadline passed in a defiant silence, Aachen was no longer treated as a city to be liberated, but as a target to be erased. The total war policy, previously reserved for the distant horizons of strategic bombing, was now focused with microscopic intensity on the cobblestones and cathedrals of the city. The air over the city centre did not just vibrate, it shattered as 62 tons of bombs were dropped in a single, 60-minute window. This was followed by a relentless rain of 5,000 artillery shells. The imperial skyline, once defined by the grace of Charlemagne's architecture, vanished into a thick cloud of smoke and pulverized brick. This was the pilot scheme for the destruction of the Third Reich. It was a systematic, point-blank pulverization that turned the city into a jagged, smoking labyrinth where the imperial jewel was traded for a graveyard of grey dust. As the American infantry moved into the ruins, the khaki-clad tide was forced to abandon the fluid mobility of the open field for a nibbling process that felt more like surgery than warfare. Tactical doctrine was rewritten in the rubble. Squads were forbidden from advancing until they had established contact with the units beside them. This was a rigid, bureaucratic pace, designed to prevent German stay-behind units from emerging like ghosts to strike from the rear. The fighting devolved into a sewer war, a subterranean nightmare where the hammering of German machine guns echoed through the damp pipes. Soldiers found themselves clearing the city block by block, house by house, and floor by floor. They often discovered that the enemy was not above them, but beneath their very boots. The Americans began to hoard reserves with a desperate caution, knowing that every cellar was a potential fortress and every sewer grate a sniper's nest. On October 16th, the encirclement was finally sealed. The German counterattacks failed, and the internal command structure began to shatter as senior officers abandoned their posts. Now, we return to that moment in the street, where Paget and Haswell stepped out with the white flag. The whizzing of sniper rounds still snaps through the air as they make their way toward the bunker. On October 21st, 1944, the end finally comes with the surrender of Colonel Wilk. In a final act of theatre, Wilk stands on the hood of a jeep to address his defeated, hollow-eyed men before being led away. General Courtney Hodges and his staff enter the Charlemagne Chapel. In a moment of profound contrast to the Nazi ideology that claimed the city, the American generals break their military stoicism to kneel in the ruins of the cathedral. The battle is over, but the cost is staggering: 80,000 American casualties and a 6-week delay. While the Allies celebrate the fall of the first German city, we cut back to the Wolf's Lair on the very day of the surrender. Hitler meets with his top commandos to finalize the plan for the winter offensive. Aachen was a speed bump that worked. The delay provided the German army the window needed to launch the Battle of the Bulge, extending the war by months. Today, a careless throng of tourists walks through the modern streets of Aachen. They walk over the hidden, violent history of the bunkers and the dead Roman ruin that once was a city that no longer exists. Deep within this subterranean underworld, the distinction between soldier and civilian dissolved in the suffocating stench of concrete air raid shelters. Thousands of people lived a sensory nightmare in the flickering gloom of the city cellars. They survived on scraps of gingerbread and a bitter scorched ersatz coffee. the locals called nigger sweat. The air they breathed was a recycled soup of unwashed bodies and the obscene belch of 4.2-inch mortars hammering the streets above. Amidst this squalor, a green hate for their Nazi masters began to fester among the civilians. They watched with hollow eyes as teenage SS veterans, some no older than 15, looted the remaining food stores while the elderly and the wounded starved. The country club atmosphere of the Nazi Party officials had long since vanished. It was replaced by a desperate, feral struggle for survival, where a 100-mark note was worth less than a dry piece of army bread. At the center of this crumbling defense stood Colonel Gerhard Wilk. His command was defined not by ideological fervor, but by a paralyzing, personal terror. He had been ordered to defend Aachen to the last bullet, but there was a darker mandate hanging over him. Wilk had been informed that if he retreated or surrendered prematurely, the Gestapo would execute his family. His defense was a symbolic, hollow theater of war, maintained through the piano wire and butcher's hooks of Nazi discipline. He lived in constant fear of his own subordinates. He especially feared the fanatical Major Rink, who prowled the command posts like a chained dog looking for any sign of defeatism. Sensing the breakdown of their nation, Wilk's men wrapped rags around their boots to muffle their movements. They moved through the ruins like shadows to avoid the red jets of flame from American dive bombers. The German defense was no longer strategic. It was a ritual of self-destruction, the final violent rage of a gangster betrayed by his own leadership. This environment of absolute attrition turned the American soldiers into punch-drunk figures of grim fatalism. They lived in a permanent stink of mud and cordite that no amount of rear-area cleanliness could erase. Their faces were etched with the Aleutian stare of men who had seen the world reduced to a grueling green nightmare. In the ruins of the Quellenhof, a former Roman bath facility turned into a German strongpoint, the Americans finally ran out of patience. They abandoned the slow process of nibbling away at the enemy and brought up the blunt force of 155mm long-tom artillery. These massive guns were fired at point-blank range into the hotel's ornate walls. A structure that had once hosted the elite of Europe was transformed into a funeral pyre of scarlet flame and black oil. As the Americans closed the gap at Hill 194, the city was effectively sealed. The imperial jewel of Charlemagne had been crushed into a dead Roman ruin. All that remained was the whizzing of the final sniper rounds and the lingering smell of burst gas mains. On the afternoon of October 16, 1944, the tactical pincer finally snapped shut. Near the battered slopes of Hill 194, the mud-caked infantry of the Old Hickory Division caught sight of the familiar olive-drab silhouettes of the Big Red One. There were no cinematic cheers. There were only the weary professional nods of men who had survived a nightmare to finally seal the city of Aachen in a ring of American steel. Inside the pocket, the German command structure didn't just bend. It shattered. Major Rink, the fanatical shadow who had once threatened to execute his own commander, finally looked at the ruins and chose survival over martyrdom. He abandoned his post and slipped through the rubble-choked streets to escape the encirclement. The defense was no longer a military operation. It was a fragmented, subterranean death rattle. Now, we return to that shivering gamble in the ruins of the Rutschstrasse. As the whizzing of sniper rounds continued to slice the air, officers Paget and Haswell felt the flimsy weight of the white flag in their hands. This scrap of cloth was the only thing standing between them and the red jets of flame from a nervous machine gunner. They stepped over the jagged remains of the city, their boots crunching on pulverized brick and shattered glass. The tension was a physical pressure in their chests as they approached the bunker. The whizzing bullets were a constant reminder that in a city of total war, a white flag was often just another target. They weren't just walking into a German command post. They were walking into the heart of a dead Roman ruin, where the air was thick with the stench of burst sewers and the obscene belch of distant mortars. When the heavy steel doors of the bunker finally groaned open, the surrender was not a grand ceremony. It was a study in exhaustion and contrast. On October 21, 1944, at 12:05 p.m., Colonel Gerhard Wilk emerged from the recycled soup of sweat and cordite. He stepped into the bright light of a cold October day. He had spent weeks under the hammering of 155mm shells, yet he emerged neatly shaven and brushed. He was a stark contrast to the scruffy, unshaven American rifleman who greeted him with hollow eyes and leveled M1 Garands. In a final, absurd act of military theatre, Wilk was hoisted onto the hood of a mud-splattered jeep. Standing there, he delivered his jeep speech to the remnants of his command. These were 1,200 hollow-eyed men, including elderly policemen and young boys who had survived on ersatz coffee and stimulant tablets. He spoke of honor and the holy soil of the Reich, but his words were drowned out by the wind whistling through the ruins. As he finished, an American soldier stepped forward and stripped the colonel of his pistol as a souvenir. It was a casual indignity that marked the end of the imperial duel. As the firing died down, General Courtney Hodges and his staff moved through the wreckage toward the Charlemagne Chapel. They walked past dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles that had been ironically painted in yellow and blue by American soldiers. They walked through streets where the phrase, "Aachen no longer exists," felt like a physical reality. Inside the cathedral, where the long black fingers of shadows reached across the ancient stone, the American generals broke their professional stoicism. They knelt in the ruins. The silence of the chapel was a jarring vacuum after 6 weeks of industrial slaughter. It was a moment of profound moral contrast. In the very seat of the First Reich, the men who had pulverized the city with heavy artillery sought a moment of spiritual peace. They knelt even as the stench of death and broken gas mains drifted through the shattered stained glass. While the Allied generals toasted their victory in the city of Charlemagne, the strategic reality on the ground was far more grim. The 6-week siege had cost the American First Army 8,000 casualties and 200 tanks. General Courtney Hodges had dismissed this bloody delay as a mere speed bump. But was it really just a minor obstacle? On the 21st of October, 1944, the very day the German commander surrendered, a far more dangerous plan was unfolding hundreds of miles away. Deep within the Wolf's Lair, the German leadership was no longer the broken shell seen in September. Adolf Hitler met with the commando Otto Skorzeny to finalize the maps for the winter counteroffensive. To the German High Command, the fall of the city was not a defeat, but a masterful success. The desperate German defenders had done exactly what they were meant to do. They had traded their lives for the grey grace of time. By holding the Americans at the frontier, they had opened a window for the German army to gather its strength in the dark forests of the Ardennes. This delay became the catalyst for the shock of the Battle of the Bulge. It was an offensive that would inflict 80,000 American casualties and extend the agony of the war by another 7 months. Today, the city that was once pulverized into a dead Roman ruin is buried beneath the feet of carefree tourists. They walk the bright, reconstructed streets, oblivious to the history beneath their feet. They do not see the long black fingers of the bunkers that still sit in the darkness beneath the fashionable shops and cafes. The whizzing of bullets has been replaced by the chatter of a city that has moved on. Yet, the legacy of this total war remains etched in the very soil. The battle for the first German city was not the beginning of the end. It was a grim stalemate that proved victory in late 1944 was far from inevitable. It left behind a graveyard of jagged stone, now hidden under the indifferent hum of the present. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.